Hello! Welcome back to another chapter of the Seven Songs of Merlin, part of the Lost Years of Merlin series. Today I'm all comfy and cozy in my pajamas, and I hope you are also comfy and cozy in your pajamas. So let's get started. In the last chapter, Merlin's new friend Ayla, the little wind spirit, left him because she's the wind, so of course she's gonna not, stick around with you forever. And he ran into Han again, the guy who gave him a dagger, and that saved him in the past, in the last book. And he grew their orchard for them, and they were like, oh my god, the harp did amazing things. And he was like, no, I did it. And they were like, oh, cool, the harp is so good. And he was kind of salty about that. And he then asked if Han would give up everything to get his treasures back. And then he decided he would have to go find his mother. So he had to find his own mother again. And like Han, he would do everything in his mortal power to succeed, even if that means leaving his work in the dark hills with the flowering harp and letting Rita Gower get strong again. But what can you do? All right, Chapter 5, The Jester. Late the following day, as strands of golden light wove gleaming threads through the grasses of the rusted plains, I stood on the crest of a rise. Below me sat a cluster of mud-brick houses, arranged in a rough circle. Their thatched roofs glowed as bright as the surrounding plains. Long wooden planks stretched between their walls, connecting the houses like the arms of young children standing in a ring. The aroma of grain roasting on a wood fire tickled my nose. I felt rising anticipation and an undercurrent of dread. For this was Caer Nithen, the town of the bards. I knew the poet Cairpri had promised to come here following the Great Council, to help repair the damage inflicted by Stangmar. And I also knew that if there was one person in all of Finkyra who could help me find my mother, it was Cairpri himself. He would not be pleased to see me again, with so much of my work still unfinished. Yet he, too, had known Ellen of the Sapphire Eyes, having tutored her years ago. I believe that he, too, longed for her to return. Hadn't he once told me that he had learned more about the art of healing from her than she had ever learned from him? Maybe, just maybe, he might know some way to bring her through the curtain of mist surrounding this island. Then, reunited with her at last, I could finish my work in the dark hills with a glad heart. I descended the slope, my staff striking the crusty soil in time to the harp thumping against my back. Listening to the swelling sounds of the village, I could not forget the eerie silence that had shrouded it in my last visit. A silence that had been, in its way, louder than a thundering tempest. Indeed, the town of the bards had only rarely known silence. No settlement in Finkyra possessed a richer history of story and song. For over the ages it had been home to many of this land's most inspired storytellers, and had witnessed many of their first performances. Even Cairpri himself, whose fame as a poet I had learned about only from others, had been born in one of those mud-brick houses. As I drew nearer to the village gates, which gleamed with golden light, more people started to emerge from their doors. Clad in long tunics of white cloth, they stood out sharply against the dry, caked mud of their homes, the dark planks of wood connecting the buildings, and the empty flower boxes clinging to most window sills. I reached for the harp, tempted to fill those flower boxes with something more than shadows, but I caught myself, deciding to wait before announcing my arrival. More and more people emerged. They looked strikingly different from one another in skin color, age, hair, shape, and size. Yet they shared one common characteristic, in addition to their white tunics. All of them seemed hesitant, uncertain about something. Instead of congregating in the open circle in the middle of the houses, they kept to the outer edge. A few stood by their doorways, pacing anxiously, but most sat down on the wooden planks that ringed the open area. They seemed to be gathering for some purpose, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something grudging about their actions. At that moment, a tall, gaunt fellow, wearing a brown cloak over his tunic, stepped into the center of the ring. Upon his head rested an odd, three-cornered hat that tilted precariously to one side like someone who had drunk too much wine. Dozens of gleaming metal spheres dangled from the hat's rim. The man began waving his long, spindly arms, flapping his loose sleeves, while bellowing some words I could not quite make out. At once I understood the circular arrangement of the houses. The whole town was a theater, and I had arrived in time for some sort of performance. As I reached the village gates, I halted. Unlike the last time I was here, no guard met me with a spear aimed at my chest. Instead, my greeting came from a newly carved sign attached to one of the gateposts. Shining in the late afternoon light, it read, "Caer Nathan, Town of the Bards, welcomes all who come in peace." Below those words, I recognized one of Cairpri's own couplets. "Here song is ever in the air, while story climbs the spiral stair." No sooner had I stepped inside the gates when a slender, shaggy-haired man jumped up from one of the planks and strode over. His tangled brows, as unruly as brambles, hung over his dark eyes. I waited for him, leaning against my staff. "Hello, Cairpri." "Merlin," he whispered, spreading his arms as if he were about to clap his hands with joy. Then, glancing over his shoulder at the gaunt man who was reciting some passage, he apparently changed his mind about clapping. "Good to see you, my boy." I nodded, realizing that he must have assumed that my work in the Dark Hills was done. It would not be easy to tell him the truth. Again he glanced at the man reciting, and at the somber, almost tearful faces of the audience. "I am only sorry you didn't arrive for a happier performance." "Oh, that's right," I whispered. "From all those sullen faces, it appears that fellow has a gift for making people feel sad. What is he reciting? Some sort of tragic poem?" Cairpri's eyebrows climbed high on his forehead. "Unfortunately not." He shook his shaggy mane. "Believe it or not, the poor fellow is trying to be funny." "Funny?" "That's right." And just then a clamorous clinking and rattling reached my ears. I turned back to the performer to see him shaking his head wildly, tossing his pointed hat from side to side. The sound came from those metal spheres. They were bells. Of course, I thought. Just right for making people laugh. Too bad they sounded so jarring, more like banging swords than ringing bells. I observed the man for a moment. His hands drooped, his shoulders sagged, and his back stooped. In addition, his entire face, including his brow, his eyes, and his mouth, seemed to frown. The effect was compounded because, despite his thin frame, he had a flabby neck with row upon row of extra chins. So when his mouth turned down once, it turned down 5 or 6 times. Suddenly, he drew his heavy cloak around himself as if he were about to deliver a speech. Then, in sad, slow tones, he started to sing, or more accurately, to wail. His voice seemed to cry. His breathing came like sobs. Like Cairpri and most of the villagers, I winced. The man may have been trying to be funny, but his singing conveyed all the joy of a funeral dirge. "When bells reach your ears, abandon all fears. Your lingering sadness will turn into gladness. Be joyful, have cheer, the Jester is here. I frolic and skip with laughs on my lip. My bells jingle sweetly, I thrill you completely. Be joyful, have cheer, the Jester is here." As the wailing continued, I turned to Cairpri. "Doesn't he know how he sounds? He is the least funny person I've ever heard." The poet heaved a sigh. "I think he does know, but he keeps on trying anyway. His name is Bumbleweed. Ever since he was a child, when he first frightened away the birds with his singing, he has dreamed of being a jester. Not just an amusing frolicker, but a true jester. Someone who practiced the high art of dressing wisdom in the garb of humor. Bumblewee the Mirthful. Bumblewee the Mirthful, he calls himself. Bumblewee the Painful suits him better. I know, I know. As I said before, bread yearns to rise beyond its size." The townspeople, meanwhile, seemed every bit as dismal as Bumblewee himself. Many held their heads in their hands. All wore scowls. One girl shook loose a woman's arm and ran into a nearby house, her black hair streaming behind her. While the woman stayed in her seat, she looked as if she envied the girl. I turned back to Cairpri, scowling myself. Why does anyone listen to him? One of his, humorous recitals, as he calls them, can ruin your next 3 meals. But like every other resident in Caer Nathan, he gets to perform in the village circle every year on the date of his birth. Cairpri shook his head, and the rest of us have to listen, even those like me who don't live here but are unlucky enough to be here on the wrong day. He waved at the village circle, his voice no longer a whisper. To think of all the truly memorable performances this same spot has seen. Nighthammer, the Vessel of Illusion, Gariant's Vow. Swiveling, he gestured toward one of the smaller, older-looking houses. Pael, whose despairing smile itself inspired volumes of poems, wrote her first poem here. He pointed to a low house with a wooden porch. Leon the Lame was born there, and let's not forget Banja, Jusipha the Jubilant, Ziphian. They all call this town home, as so many others, as have so many other fabled bards. Again I peered at Bumbleweed, whose long arms flailed as he droned on. The only place he will ever be a Jester is in his dreams. Carefree nodded grimly. All of us have our private dreams, but few of us cling to dreams so far removed from our true capabilities. In days long past, Bumbleweed might have saved one of the treasures of Finkyra, the magical horn known as the Caller of Dreams. Think of it, Merlin. The caller, when blown by someone immensely wise, could bring a person's most cherished dream to life, even a dream as far-fetched as Bumbleweed's. That is why it is often called, in story and song, the Horn of Good Tidings. Lines deeper than the scars on my own face appeared on Carepre's brow. I knew that he was remembering how Rita Gower had perverted the magic of the Caller of Dreams to bring only evil tidings to life. In the case of this very village, he had brought about the most terrifying dream of any poet, bard, or musician. He had silenced completely the voices of all who dwelled here, rendering useless the very instruments of their souls. That was why the town of bards has been quiet as a graveyard when I last came here. Carepre's tormented expression told me that, while the curse itself had departed with the collapse of the shrouded castle, its memory lived on. The bells of Bumbleweed's hat started jangling again, louder than before. If I had not been holding my staff, I would have covered my ears. Nudging Carepre, I asked, "Why don't you try the Caller of Dreams on him yourself?" "I couldn't." "Why not?" "First of all, my boy, I am not about to try to take anything, certainly not one of the treasures, from the Grandaluce's cave where they now reside. I'll leave that to someone much braver, or stupider. But that isn't the main reason. The fact is, I am not wise enough to use the Caller." I blinked in surprise. Not wise enough? Why, the poet of Carepre is known throughout the land as a rhymer, a quoter, an idealistic fool, he finished. Have no illusions, I brim with confusions. But at least I am wise enough to know one important thing, how little I really do know. That's ridiculous. I've seen your library. All of those books. You can't tell me you don't know anything. I didn't say I don't know anything, my boy. I said I don't know enough. There's a difference. And to think that I could command the legendary Caller of Dreams, well, that would be a terrible act of hubris. Hubris? From the Greek word hybris, meaning arrogance, excessive pride in oneself. It's a flaw that has felled many a great person. His voice dropped again to a whisper, including, I am told, your own grandfather. I stiffened. You mean Tuatha? Yes, Tuatha, the most powerful wizard Finkyra has ever known, the only mortal ever allowed to visit the other world to consult with Dagda and return alive. Even he was susceptible to hubris, and it killed him. The flowering harp felt suddenly heavier, the sling digging into my shoulder. How did he die? Carepre leaned closer. I don't know the details. No one does. All I know is he overestimated his own power and underestimated Rita Gower's most fearsome servant, a one-eyed ogre named Balor. He shook himself. But let us speak of more pleasant things. My boy, tell me about the harp. You've made quick work of the dark hills if you've already down here in the plains. I shifted uncomfortably, rubbing my hand over the knotted top of my staff. As I felt the deep grooves, the scent of hemlock spiced the air, reminding me of the woman whose fragrances had filled my childhood. The time had come to tell Carepre what I wanted to do, and what I had left undone. Taking a deep breath, I declared, I haven't finished my work in the hills. He caught his breath. You haven't? Did you meet trouble? Warrior goblins on the loose? I shook my head. The only trouble is of my own making. The bottomless pools of his eyes examined me. What are you saying? That I've discovered something more important than my task. I faced the poet squarely. I want to find my mother, to bring her to Finkyra. Anger flashed across his face. You would place us all in danger because of that? My throat tightened. Kirpri, please. I will finish the task, I promise, but I need to see her again, and soon. Is that so much to ask? Yes! You are putting all the creatures of this land at risk. I tried to swallow. Ellen gave up everything for me, Kirpri. She loved her life here, loved it to the depths of her soul, and she left it all just to protect me. During our time in Gwynedd, I was, well, her only companion, her only friend, even though I never did much to deserve it. I paused, thinking about her sad songs, her healing hands, her wondrous blue eyes. We had our problems, believe me, but we were much closer than either of us knew. Then one day I left her there, all alone. Just left her. She must be miserable in that cold stone room. She might even be sick or in trouble. So while I want to bring her here for me, it's also for her. Carepri's expression softened lightly. He laid a hand on my shoulder. Listen, Merlin, I understand. How many times I myself have longed to see Ellen again. But even if we put aside the dark hills to bring someone here from the world beyond the mists, well, to do that is impossibly dangerous. Are you certain? The sea has spared me twice. It's not the sea, my boy, though that voyage is dangerous enough. Finkyra has its own ways, its own rhythms that mortals can only guess. Even Dagda himself, it is said, dares not predict who may be allowed to pass through the curtains of mist. I don't believe it. His gaze darkened. There would be dangers to anyone brought here from outside, and dangers to the rest of Finkyra as well. He closed his eyes and thought. What you may not understand is that anyone who arrives here, even the tiniest little butterfly, could change the balance of life on Finkyra and cause untold destruction. You're sounding like Domnu, I scoffed, saying I'm going to be the ruin of all Finkyra. He swung his head toward the village gates, no longer aglow with golden light. Beyond them, the dark hills rolled like waves on a stormy sea. You could be just that, especially if you don't finish what you've begun. Won't you help me? Even if I knew a way, I wouldn't help you. You're only a boy, and a more foolish one than I had thought. I pounded my staff on the ground. I have the power to make the harp work, don't I? You yourself told the Great Council that I have the heart of a wizard. Well, perhaps I also have the power to bring my mother here. His hand squeezed my shoulder so hard I winced. Don't say such things, even in jest. It takes far more than heart to be a true wizard. You need the spirit, the intuition, the experience. You need the knowledge, enormous knowledge about the patterns of the cosmos and all of the arts of magic. And, even more, you need the wisdom, the sort of wisdom that tells you when to use those arts and when to refrain. For a true wizard wields his power judiciously, the way an expert bowman wields his arrows. I'm not speaking about arrows, I'm speaking about my mother, Ellen. I drew myself up straight. If you won't help me, then I will find another way. Carepri's brow creased again. A true wizard needs one thing more. What is that? I asked impatiently. Humility. Listen well, my boy. Forget this madness. Take the harp and return to your work in the hills. You have no idea the risks you are taking. I would take many more to bring her back to me. He looked skyward. Help me, O Dagda. Returning his gaze to me, he asked, How can I make you understand? There is a proverb as old as this island itself, saying that only the wisest shell from the shore of speaking shells can guide someone through the mists. It sounds simple enough, and yet no wizard in history, not even Tuatha, has even dared to try. Does that give you some sense of the danger? I grinned. No, but it does give me an idea. Merlin, no! You mustn't! On top of all the other dangers, there is yet another, to you. Attempting such an act of deep wizardry will tell Rita Gower exactly where you are, and more, I'm afraid. When he returns, bent on conquering the worlds and the others, he will pursue you, mark my words. I tugged on the sling of the harp. I don't fear him. Carepri's brambly brows lifted. Then you had better start, for with hubris like that, you will offer him the sweetest revenge of all, making you one of his servants, just as he did your father. My stomach clenched as if I had been struck. You're saying I'm no better than Stangmar? I'm saying you are just as vulnerable. If Rita Gower doesn't kill you outright, he will try to enslave you. Just then, a man's shadow fell upon us. I whirled around to face Bumbleweed. Apparently, he had finished his recital and approached us, and we had been too absorbed in conversation to notice that he had been listening. He bowed awkwardly, causing his hat to fall on the ground with a noisy rattle. He retrieved the hat. Then, shoulders slumped, he faced Carefree. I did miserably, didn't I? Carefree, still glaring at me, waved them away. Some other time. I'm talking with the boy right now. Turning his frowning chins toward me, Bumblewee said glumly, You tell me then. Did I do miserably or not? Thinking that if I answered him, he would leave, I frowned back at him. Yes, you were miserable. But he did not leave. He merely bobbed his head sullenly, clanking the bells. So I botched the delivery. Too true, too true, too true. Merlin, growled Carefree, heed my warnings. I only want to help you. My cheeks burned. Help me? Is that why you tried to dissuade me the last time from going to the Shrouded Castle? Or why you didn't tell me that Stangmar was really my father? The poet grimaced. I didn't tell you about your father because I feared that such a terrible truth might forever wound you. Make you doubt or even hate yourself. Perhaps I was wrong in that, as I was wrong in thinking you couldn't destroy the castle, but I'm not wrong in this. Go back to the Dark Hills. I glanced at the village gates, shrouded by shadows. They stood as dark as gravestones. First, I'm going to the shore of speaking shells. Before Carefree could respond, Bumblewee cleared his throat, making his multiple chins quiver. Then he swiveled his cloak around himself with dramatic flair. I'm coming with you. What? I exclaimed. I don't want you to come. Too true, too true, too true. Yet I will come all the same. Carefree's dark eyes gleamed. You will regret your choice even sooner than I expected. Okie dokie, gang. That was chapter 5. So we will read chapter 6 tomorrow, called Through the Mists. Have an awesome night, y'all.